kind of connect the dots a little bit more clearly when we go from artist to artist. So on the timeline first, we have Big Joe Turner, and Big Joe Turner was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and he was primarily a vocalist. He had a deep, cutting voice. His music would have been considered R&B once again, that kind of coming from that jump blues background. But he has one of the very definitive rock and roll hits along the way, and so he's probably our first real rock and roll artist with his song, which we'll talk about, his big hit song, a little bit later. We'll get into that. But a little bit of his background. There's pretty limited information on his early life, actually. One of the main, I guess, unfortunate things, really, that's known about him is his father was killed in a railroad accident. So he was raised by his mother and grandmother. He grew up singing in churches and street corners, like a lot of the younger vocalists that we talked about who grew up in city life. One of the things about him is Big Joe Turner. His name kind of fits his image throughout his life, so he looked a lot older than he actually was. So even when he was young, still in his early teens, he started to perform in the nightclubs in Kansas City, which was, provide him with a lot of early experience that a lot of people don't get. And as he performed in the nightclubs, he would also work, like bartend there. And apparently one night he met his soon-to-be collaborator and long-term partner in music, Pete Johnson, who was a piano player. And so once they hit it off there, they built up a reputation. They started to put a few things together. And at one point, while they were performing in a club, John Hammond, who was a well-known music scout and concert/music producer, he got word of Joe, and he saw them in the club, and he invited them to record in New York. And so this is around 1938, and early on, in some of the early sessions, they recorded what was one of Big Joe Turner's kind of signature hits, which was called Rollin' Pete, formerly known as It's All Right, Baby, and he recorded this at the Vocalion label. They also recorded for Decca Records later on in 1941, and during this time they were performing pretty consistently together, but once they got to Decca Records in 1941, they had been working together for a while, so the relationship kind of started to fray. They continued to perform together on and off, but that was kind of what got them both started, specifically for Big Joe Turner. And so after a while, they kind of split ways, and Big Joe Turner, moved to Los Angeles in the early 1940s, and he was performing around there for a while. And in 1947, he recorded My Gal's Jockey with National Records, which was really his first radio hit. During that time, he in LA, he recorded for a bunch of different labels, all through the 1940s, and then when we hit 1950, he recorded with young Fats Domino, who we'll talk about a little bit later in this episode. That song was called Still in the Dark. And so by this time, his career has slowed pretty significantly. One of the things to look at with Big Joe Turner is, he recorded his first hit in 1938. So that would have marked pretty early in our timeline. And just to keep track of his age, because he hits a hard point around the 1950s. He did get a fill-in spot with Count Basie's Count Basie's group, and that got him a contract with Atlantic Records. And Atlantic Records, during this time was that was the place to be for what was considered R&B at the time, but a lot of the big rock and roll musicians that we talk about during this era, Atlantic, was huge at the time. So he got that signing with Atlantic Records, and his first track, "Chains of Love," got him back on the charts, and it marked the beginning of the most successful recording period of his career. He had tracks called "Sweet 16," "Chill Is On," "Don't You Cry," and his first track to actually top the charts was "Honey Hush." And then in 1953, he moved to Chicago, and he recorded a track with Elmore James, another legend who's not on the timeline, but blues legend. He recorded a track called "TV Mama" with Elmore James. And so around this time, he was still with Atlantic Records. Jesse Stone, who was a pianist, and he was also a prolific songwriter. He worked for Atlantic Records, and he wrote "Shake, Rattle, and Roll" for Joe Turner in 1954. And Jesse Stone and Big Joe Turner had already crossed paths at one point earlier in his career. And so when Jesse Stone wrote the song, Big Joe Turner had a big, sort of voice that just cut through the record or through the venue wherever it was performing. He just had a dominant voice, and so he wrote the song with that in mind. And "Shake, Rattle, and Roll" is, pretty clearly a rock and roll song. Of course, during this time, it would have still appeared on the R&B charts, but Jesse Stone, because of this, and just during that time period, he had been involved in the music industry, in the music scene as a musician also for a while, and he had kind of been working on some of these building blocks that resembled early rock and roll, and "Shake, Rattle, and Roll" was kind of that culmination of all of that. So Jesse Stone is really credited with, creating some of those early building blocks of rock and roll. So yeah, "Shake, Rattle, and Roll," a big hit. It was perfect for Big Joe Turner's sort of, he had this really hard jump blues style that was already kind of edging towards rock and roll, similar to what we looked at with Ruth Brown and some of her songs. This is all around the 1950s, so this is where rock and roll really starts going, and you can kind of see these artists like Big Joe Turner, just the natural progression from jump blues, kind of getting that harder rhythm, matching with the vocals, and you can see how it kind of naturally progresses to what became rock and roll. And the song actually, I don't know if it was intentional or sort of just coincidental, or just, Jesse Stone, he had a background in blues piano, as I said. So the song actually makes like kind of a lot of callbacks from early lines in older blues songs. Something to look into if you're interested, but it really kind of, older blues too. So it kind of just takes some, not necessarily well-known, probably some more, I guess you could say, niche songs from anywhere from country blues to some of the more mainstream ish blues songs that were from the earlier days, and adds them to the song, which I think was done sort of colorfully, not in a way where they're kind of stealing it away. It was almost kind of paying homage to a certain extent, although I'm not sure that any of those songs were necessarily like household classics. So could have been seen as a little bit of a minor theft, but I think it's pretty cool, something that's interesting to look into. Um, but the way that the song was similar to songs that we talked about before, it was seen as too suggestive, and so that really reduced the radio play and it limited its exposure. But as I said, it was still successful. It was a new song, a new type of song that hadn't really been heard before. But eventually, both Bill Haley and Elvis Presley recorded versions that were, radio appropriate or seen as radio appropriate, radio friendly, and they were way more successful, much more successful, as far as reception, listener reception, and radio play. So the success of Shake, Rattle, and Roll really continued to, kind of fuel that resurgence of Big Joe Turner's career. And one thing to remember is, as I was talking about before, is his age. He was actually 43, in his 40s already when he released this major song. So he had a little bit of early success, not really in the mainstream. Had a clear slump, and then he really came back, and it was really in his 40s, which is not so common for musicians to have at least their really initial resurgence at this point in their life. So he got some films, some TV. TV was becoming a big thing at that time, including a show called Showtime at the Apollo. But at least for black artists, rock and roll was a little bit short-lived. A lot of it had to do with the music phenomenon, the British invasion, which we'll talk about. It's kind of a reoccurring theme for these rock and roll guys throughout the episode. So as that kind of took over, he shifted to more of a performing like jazzy numbers. But one note is in 1969 he did make an album with T-Bone Walker and Otis Spann, who are pretty big stars. Of course, T-Bone Walker was featured early on the timeline, but those big three were pretty big. They had big careers, success in their own right. And so in 1969, which is much later down the road, past what would probably be considered the prime of their careers, they put together this session that refers to them as the Super Black Blues Band, and the title of the album is also called Super Black Blues. And it's not really a commercially known album, but it's a cool album if you are into any of those artists individually, but also I think it represents the timeline pretty well, because it encapsulates Big Joe Turner and T-Bone Walker, and kind of shows them later in their career after they're kind of past their success, trying to make hits. It's kind of almost a more laid back. They're kind of jamming a little bit, so it's a fun album to listen to if that's your vibe. There's some slow blues. I would say it's more of a slow blues type album with, all of them had a little bit of a different background, so a lot more gets mixed in there, but I would say that the core of it is pretty bluesy. And that's